Theology nerds, this is Trip.
This is Nathan.
And this is a WhyGo webinar edition of the Theology Nerd Podcast. That's right, we did a webinar with Scott Paeth, who is theological ethics professor at DePaul in Chicago, and he was like, why go Niebuhr? Do you want to be a Niebhurian?
Why not? You know, I want to get real.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? You know what I mean?
Yeah, you
know
do. Well, he is a realist. So, Reinhold Niebuhr, probably the most influential ethicist of the 20th century. You'll find out a lot about him. 5 reasons to think about bringing Niebuhr back for our current situation, along with Scott Paeth, who, I noticed that Scott on social media is a bit more snarky, humorous, and direct than Scott on a webinar. When he's talking, he goes into professorial mode. He likes to think and be, but on the internet,
no holds barred, man.
Yeah,
it's awesome.
So if you aren't following Scott on Facebook, just for theological ethics comments about whatever is going through his mind, you're missing out. Yeah. We should just make sure we put a link on the post for this. But yeah, this is Reinhold Niebuhr WhyGo, and also know this is one of the reasons you should follow the Homebrewed Facebook page, because when the webinars that basically when I'm recording episodes with people that are like, I'll go live, I'll record this while people watch, then you'll find out if you follow the Homebrewed Christianity Facebook page. And as we're recording this, we're like 2 from 6,666 followers, and you don't want it to linger there. No, you got to bust on through. So go over there. You'll be able to follow, and then you can ask questions and stuff during future webinars. The other thing you can do is say, like, Trip, this is great, I want to support the podcast. Then go to homebrewedcommunity.com. There you can join up to the community. These are the people that bring the goods week after week. You should tell them all thank you and say, I didn't know y'all are all supporting this. Now I want to join in, because not only can you get your own ecclesiastical title or access to all the past classes that we've done, like high gravity classes. I did some with Pete Rollins, did some with Philip Clayton. We've done a whole series of epic reads things on books and such. We have some Q&As and all sorts of things that are just for members. But you also get to meet the community, and everyone that's in there loves to give each other input, support, advice, especially on nerdy things, live things. You also get to give input on what we do at Homebrewed. So,
fun things like Epiphanation.
Epiphanation. If you don't know what that is, you should go back and listen to that episode.
Absolutely.
And this is the point in the where we should give everyone an update about how future Epiphanation for Team Australia is going.
It's going really well because we have a griddle now, which means that we can get up super early, which is not super early for Australians, and make a ton of pancakes.
Oh yeah,
and epiphanate.
Yeah,
halfway across the world.
So Epiphanation is a live podcast where every 12-ish minutes, theoretically, a different member of the Homebrewed community gets on and talks about any topic they want. And I attempt to just epiphanate in responding to it, and then they respond, and we have a communal epiphanation of the Homebrewed community right there, and then we go to the next person, and it's a 3-hour soiree. That probably an hour of it shareable on the internet. And while you're epiphanating, you also share whatever delicious craft beers and things you have.
That's right.
Through the process, so it's kind of like late night discussions about God around a campfire with some beverages mixed with drunk dialing and in a community building experience. That's right. Epiphanation. And so we want to bring it to the Australians.
Because, we don't want to leave them out.
They're always like, I slept through this.
I know, it's really hard with the time difference and everything, so we're willing.
So we're going to
get up super early to do this.
And we got a griddle now at the hatchery.
Yeah.
This is a school where I teach at. Nathan's a student here. We have a new griddle. And so what we're going to do, especially if you're in L.A., because then we could have other people joining us. We're going to have a big beer breakfast. We got some pancakes and omelets and junk. And then we're going to epiphanate with all of our Aussies who will just be up late. Liam would do it.
Oh yeah.
All the people that were on the Jesus 1224 thing. See, this is for you. It's just called a servant's heart.
That's right.
So
be a homebrew community member so you can do fun stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think Liam should get all of his friends over there, and then we can put them on the screen in here. And they're having like a dinner. We're having a breakfast. And then it's just a communal epiphanation.
That sounds glorious.
I know, because after that, they'll clearly want us to come do the podcast in Australia.
I don't have a problem going to Australia.
I don't either. Especially when I found out the Earth wasn't flat. Going down under wasn't nearly as scary.
They have really good coffee.
They do?
Too. Yeah.
Well, there you go.
That's where the flat white comes from.
Oh, that is true. Mm-hmm. I like flat whites.
See?
I don't like Starbucks flat whites. They give you any size, but don't keep the ratio of espresso to milk. And I'm like, no, adding a lot more milk does not help the flat white.
It's just a latte.
Yeah. That's not how, flat, that means something different apparently in Australia. Yeah. Anyway, this is Reinhold Niebuhr.
I wonder if he liked flat white. I imagine he just drank his coffee black.
20th century, he grew up doing labor organizing in Detroit and stuff, and then he's teaching at Union. He's probably a black coffee drinker.
Yeah.
And he's probably one of those that preferred Folgers.
Yeah.
Because he's just exactly. I'm going to get my work done. I'm a realist.
Yeah.
Why do I want a savory experience with these burnt beans? I don't even know if he sounded like that. I'm projecting. So don't take my word for it. Take Scott's. All right. Why go, Niebuhr?
All right. Hello, everybody. This is Tripp, and it is time to Why Go Niebuhr time. It is time to go Niebuhr. You may be saying, why should I go Niebuhr? And that's a good question because Scott Paeth is here to help us think about going Niebuhr. That's right. Scott Paeth, who's written a book on Niebuhr, likes to think about Niebuhr, and now is here to get Niebuhrlicious with you. How are you doing, Scott?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Tripp?
Well. Now that we know how to turn on your video, so I can see your face while doing this, I feel much better. I also know that when we discussed the different Why Goes, I was not anticipating scheduling a Why Go Niebuhr right after the inauguration of our new president. So I feel like there was a certain serendipitous timing for this seminar.
One might say it's providential.
Ooh, there you go. And so maybe before jumping in and getting into Niebuhr, why don't you say just a bit about yourself so people that haven't listened to the other times you've been on the podcast know who in the world Scott is?
Sure. Hi, how you doing? My name is Scott. Scott Paeth. I'm an associate professor of religious studies at DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois. And I've written a number of books on ethics and public theology. And the one that's particularly relevant today is the Niebuhr Brothers for Armchair Theologians, which is published by Westminster John Knox Press. I'm interested in issues of religion, public policy, Christian social ethics, and all that sort of thing.
So, who is Reinhold Niebuhr for the not so theological nerdy person?
Reinhold Niebuhr was probably the most influential American theologian of the 20th century. He taught at Union Theological Seminary in New York City for most of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He died in 1972, I believe, and most of the things that he is best known for are books that talk about the relationship of Christian ethics to what was going on in the world during that time. So he was very concerned with the rise of fascism in the 1930s, the question of the morality of war in the 1940s, the question of the Cold War in the 1950s. And in his last writings in the 1960s and 70s, he was very concerned with issues of the Vietnam War, abuse of power in Watergate, and the questions of civil rights. And if it was something that was going on during his life, he was deeply interested in what Christianity had to say about it.
And when people engage Niebuhr today, oftentimes it's because famous politicians or kind of political commentators have talked about him. So what do you think those kind of most popular misunderstandings of who he is as a figure that we need to kind of be attentive to before kind of digging into some of his commitments?
I think one thing that probably is one of the biggest misunderstandings about Niebuhr is that he is sort of a one-note theologian, that basically he is either a doctrinaire liberal or a doctrinaire conservative, or that he or that he was only interested in arguing in favor of war, or he was only interested in a kind of neoconservative approach to foreign policy. When the fact is that one of the challenging things about studying Reinhold Niebuhr is the fact that you can't pin him down to only one place on the political spectrum or only one set of opinions. He was well known for his capacity to change his mind over a period of time, which is one of the reasons why one of the earliest biographies of him, echoing his famous Serenity Prayer, was called The Courage to Change. Because he did have the courage to change his mind and did so very publicly many times in the course of his life.
So is that why he's more of an ethicist than a theologian, because he changes his mind? Because I know that systematic theologians, you aren't supposed to change your mind. That's why it's a system.
Yeah. Well, some people would say that he's more of an ethicist because he simply doesn't have a very well-developed theology. That if once you kind of take him out of the realm of fairly basic theological concepts, he doesn't really go very deep. Whereas when it comes to the question of how as Christians we're supposed to engage society here and now, he has things to say which were relevant in the 1930s and which remain relevant today.
So you've made a list, 5 reasons to go Niebhurian. Or maybe 5 reasons to get Niebuhrlicious. But I don't know what the right way of putting it, but I'm looking forward to talking about them. And the first reason why go Niebuhr? Because Niebuhr helps us understand human nature.
Yes, exactly. By the way, I would say maybe what we should say is one reason to love your Niebuhr.
And 5 points. I think has anyone heard a high quality theology professor dad joke like that recently? Now you have. Scott just rocked it.
I have 3 children. I'm a master of dad jokes. Mm-hmm. So, okay. So yeah, he helps us to understand human nature. And here's one of the places where I think that Niebuhr actually goes deepest when it comes to theology, is his understanding of the relationship of human nature to the problem of sin. And most people find him as a theologian at his most profound on issues of theological anthropology. For Niebuhr, the main problem that we confront as human beings is that we recognize that we're both finite and free. As finite creatures, we are limited in terms of time, in terms of space, in terms of the possibilities that we can actualize in our lives. But at the same time, as free creatures, we also recognize the infinite number of possibilities that are placed in front of us. And the fact that we cannot realize every possibility that we'd like to realize, for Niebuhr, causes us anxiety. And that anxiety creates a tension within us that we feel compelled to resolve. And what he says is that as human beings, we have one of 2 possible ways of resolving that tension. We can either assert our freedom and deny our finitude. And that is what he calls the root of the sin of pride. Or he says we can deny our freedom and wallow in our own finitude. And he talks about that as kind of concupiscence or acrosia, right? The idea that we are not in fact free, that we that we're determined by forces outside of ourselves. And so what he says is that the besetting problem that we confront in public life is generally that of pride, right? That politicians are classic examples of people who want to assert their own freedom over against their own finitude. Whereas issues like alcoholism, drug addiction, various things which we would today say would be in need of some form of therapy, are generally what he would group under the problems of self-denial. Mm-hmm. But they're both sins. It's just he's more interested overall in the sin of pride.
So that kind of tension between nature, necessity, and freedom, where they're mutually limiting and determining each other, is a way he both understands the individual and the human predicament, but also he uses it and kind of reframes it to think of our social, cultural, political predicament. So can you say how that understanding of human nature helps him frame kind of individual ethical thought, but also at the more cultural, political level?
Right, and this is the central argument that he makes in his first great book, which is Moral Man and Immoral Society, which later in life he actually said that if he had to do it again, he would have titled it differently. He would have called it Immoral Man and His Even More Immoral Societies. But for him, the problem is that virtue, sanctity, the capacity for moral action are not really possible for social groups. An individual can choose to engage in acts of self-denial, can choose to prefer another person's well-being to his own. But Niebuhr argues that is not something which is possible for groups. Groups are innately driven and inescapably driven by their own collective egoism. And what that means is that groups will always fight to assert their own power over against the power of other groups or against individuals.
In part of that, I think really connects to the second reason to love your neighbor, and that's that Niebuhr teaches us to confront evil while recognizing our own.
Yeah, exactly. The thing with Niebuhr's approach to questions of morality in public life is that he's aware of the fact that we can't pretend that evil is not a real problem in need of confrontation. And that goes back to his experience as a pastor in Detroit in the 1920s, when he was very involved in the social gospel movement. He was a pacifist. He became a pacifist after touring Europe in the wake of World War I. And what he saw in Europe, he saw the carnage and the destruction of World War I, and he walked away and he says, well, I'm done with the war business now. Although he never actually served in the military. But he says, he supported World War I as a German American. And he did it precisely because he thought that it was his responsibility as an American to assert his Americanness over against his German heritage. And what happened after World War I was he was very disillusioned by just how much destruction we caused in Europe. And so at the time, he became a pacifist. He rejected violence and coercion of all kinds, and he eventually became the president of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is a very famous pacifist organization. The problem for him as a pastor in Detroit, though, was that he recognized that a Christian ethic of love, which depended on complete non-coercion of the other, and which was only permitted to change people's minds through moral suasion, was not actually capable of achieving social change. He argued the problem was that if you are someone who's powerless, or you are a powerless group, trying to get power from a group that already has it, the group that already has it has an innate interest in ensuring that you don't get it. And as long as you're not willing to use coercion to force them to give it to you, All they have to do in order to prevent you from having power is simply keep you talking until the end of time. And so during the 1930s, he began to reject this conception of pacifism, which said that the only way you can change things is through moral suasion. He says, and he began to say, no, as Christians, we need to embrace the possibility of using coercion in order to affect change. And this put him on the outs with a lot of people in the social gospel movement. It put him out on the outs with a lot of his allies on the Christian left, and ultimately led to his resignation as the president of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And the reason is because for him, he believed that an idea that Christianity is about seeking your own moral perfection, even if it means being completely socially ineffective, is ultimately a denial both of our own capacity for evil and of the importance of fighting evil in the midst of our actual concrete historical circumstances.
Well, one of the elements that I think that inspired this, that is hard, I think, for contemporary kind of more progressive Christians to get, is that one of the things he was realizing was how much liberal Protestantism in its really its more idealistic shape early in his career chose the side of Renaissance thinkers as opposed to reformers when it came to understanding the debate around human anthropology, human destiny, and history, and that in the rediscovery for him of meaning in history as he's rejecting this unreserved affirmation of human potential, but he's not doing it as like let's coerce people and get all we can out now, but we know what God really wants is this peace thing, but it's just not rational to be super PC lovey-dovey. He's doing it because the actual understanding of history he's trying to articulate in light of human nature and in light of the gospel is one where it doesn't justify a kind of a naive idealism, which is number 3, that Niebuhr challenges naive idealism.
We're burning through these.
Well,
I think we'll have to come back to some of them.
Yeah.
They're all interrelated. But yeah, I think, I do want to go back a little bit to this idea of recognizing evil, of challenging evil while recognizing our own before we jump into number 3, because it seems to me that the most important insight that he has in the 1930s is the recognition that we have to take sides in the struggle for social justice. We can't remain aloof. The problem that we get into is when we assume, as a lot of his allies in the struggle assumed, either liberal Christians or Marxists or others, that the fact that the other guy is wrong means that we're completely right. And the fact that the other guy is engaged in actions which we deem evil means that we're necessarily virtuous. And it's and key to his understanding of the role of group action in social movements is that we are always implicated in the same kinds of sin that the groups that we challenge are implicated in. We are not absolved from the capacity for evil simply because we're fighting evil. And the challenge for us is always to recognize that that the victories of good in history and in society are always partial and always subject to reversal. And that to become the victor in a struggle for justice often puts you in the position of re-victimizing your former oppressors. And this is something that we've seen over and over again when social groups are victorious in struggle against oppressors, is that they then will often turn around and oppress those who had oppressed them. And so Niebuhr says the antidote for that is to recognize that we are affected by the same sin and by the same egotism that our opponents are.
So one of the questions I have about this, and it's really came out of reading Nature and Destiny of Man recently, and I thought to myself, next time I talk to Scott, I want to ask him this. So when he is drawing this contrast that you mentioned earlier between human nature and freedom, one of the points of that is to say that when we start to discuss history, this place that where something about who the God of history is to be revealed, we shouldn't then think that history is determined and reduced just to nature necessity, because it's constitutive of human beings, that freedom's involved. But it's that tension between our nature, necessity, and freedom that's there. But he also takes this to say then that, we need to recognize as Christians then that we have to draw that distinction between fulfillment in history, which is a product of a product of history that comes out of itself, out of its own nature, and the contrast between that fulfillment in history with fulfillment of history. And that macro story, the story for justice, reconciliation, transformation, all that kind of stuff runs parallel to that question about human nature, our nature necessity, and human destiny, which was revealed in the judgment of our nature in Christ, in the promise of that nature given in the resurrection.
Right. And that, this is why, he writes 2 volumes, and it's the nature gets all the attention. And often people don't pay enough attention to his understanding of human destiny. But you're absolutely right. For him, the problem is that all of our struggles for social justice take place within the context of history. And that history is, by definition, a limited and partial dimension of reality. And so for Niebuhr, he always wants to emphasize that all of the fulfillments of our aspirations within history are always going to be fragmentary. That our goal and our destiny is not within history, but beyond it. And so therefore, we cannot seek the complete fulfillment of our desires within the historical context, but we always have to recognize that our desires are unsatisfiable within history. Now, this is an important point of contrast with his brother, Richard, who wrote on many similar subjects. And I wouldn't say that Richard thinks that all of our ambitions are satisfiable within history, but what Richard does say is that God is much more present within the historical flux than Reinhold is willing to admit. So that for Richard, we can actually find God operating within the historical struggles, and therefore we can achieve much fuller expressions of Christian truth within history than Reinhold wants to allow. Reinhold thinks that God is not active within the historical process, but is something which exists outside and always beyond it. So all we can do is gesture toward the fulfillment that we seek in God, but we can never actually arrive there.
Well, I think one of the reasons that he emphasizes the limits of history is so that there's a recognition that the struggle for justice is a struggle for possibilities under the terms of those limits, and that being honest or clear-headed about the limits is actually an asset to movements and struggles for justice, rather than a deflationary statement. And like he even has that discussion around how like the love commandment, which he includes all of the statements that Jesus makes about love of neighbor and enemy and things. He says that it's essential precisely because it's not historically possible, and that the full implication of it is there as both as an ideal to struggle for, move towards, but also it demonstrates that kind of dialectical relation between history and the eternal, which includes that in every moment of history, the coming of the kingdom of God comes with a judgment. which is the beginning of grace. And that is the Christian understanding of the realism at the heart of his thought.
Exactly. And grace and judgment are both simultaneously present in all human action, right? Human action is virtuous, but it's never fully virtuous, right? Human action is good, but it's never fully good. And so we're always in the situation where even our most virtuous and pristine action is always tainted by our own self-seeking, our own egotism, our own desire for approval. And so it's never genuinely pure because we're always at least somewhat affected by that anxiety, right? That is at the heart of our nature. And so we're always looking to resolve that inner tension. And one of the important things about this idea pertains to his understanding of where Jesus fits into the Christian story. Because as Niebuhr understands it, if the human condition is one of anxiety, Jesus as a human being was not free from that anxiety any more than anyone else was. What Jesus did that other human beings did not do was that Jesus did not try to collapse his anxiety into either a sort of a celebration of his freedom or wallowing in finitude. Rather, he was able to remain fully within his own anxiety and therefore overcome it. And he did so through an act of complete self-giving and complete selfless love through his death on the cross.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that the nature of Christian hope that he develops, I think it's when he draws a contrast between the hope of resurrection and the immortality of the soul. Some of it becomes clear because he said that hope for this world comes from God alone, and it's not natural, right? Like you're not naturally immortal, you're worm food. And that then kind of emphasizes that hope is tied to history, but it's not one where the hope itself is inherent in history. It's the hope then is a product of grace, which is this connecting of the gift and grace of freedom to kind of nature and necessity.
Right. It's that reaching beyond historical possibility.
In what the other part that I think I find fascinating is that he's actually arguing that this religious account is better than kind of secular or political accounts or too idealistic accounts because it recognizes pride. It has an inherent suspicion and criticism of any ideology that either voice a type of escapism from history to the eternal, and that's something he puts against forms of evangelicalism as well, or ones that see the answer to history as being birthed from history itself, which any type of materialistic reform he points out. It's like when Jesus in the temptation says man does not live by bread alone, he's pointing out that the anxiety or the human predicament is not simply resolved materially. And I think that the positive case that he's making is one of the reasons that his challenge to a naive idealism isn't a sneaky way of being realist about human predicaments and justifying contemporary forms of power and oppression. But he's trying to point out that the Christian view and understanding of history itself challenges these type of progressive and conservative idealisms.
Yeah, exactly. And, of course, he's always most interesting when he's sort of engaged in this kind of mutual critique of two different possibilities, right? Where he'll say, here are the problems of a Freudian conception of humanity versus here's the problems with a Marxist conception of humanity, right? He always wants to say that all of these different accounts of human nature and human political possibility they all ultimately fail because they tend to overemphasize one dimension of that polarity or the other, right? They either in the Freud's case see us as being wholly subject to, our id, right? And, or our various neuroses sort of render us incapable of genuine freedom, versus Marxists who believe that the only thing that we need to do is cast off the chains of capitalist repression, and then we'll be able to eliminate all of the problems of poverty and warfare. And Niebuhr says that it's only by recognizing the partial dimension of these other recipes for human happiness that we actually recognize that Christianity provides a balance between those two polarities. And in this way, he's really kind of a classic kind of Protestant preacher, right? Because, he was a preacher for many years and preached throughout his entire career as an academic. And his writing has this character of a sermon, right? Where he's saying, well, this is one possibility you can consider. Well, this is another possibility you can consider. And then he finally says, but have you considered this possibility, right? And he brings it back to the gospel account of humanity.
In one of the things that that is I don't know how you'd say it, inspiring about his life, career, and such, not only is just that you mentioned about him changing his mind and taking these things seriously, but he was always invested in the church, in the academy, and in the principal players of American politics and such. Like he because I don't know, we don't need to name our friends that we think might do this or people we know we've read, but I think there is a tendency for theologians and for ministers to imagine prophetic engagement or leadership to happen in a vacuum where you think your congregation should get here, then you get mad they don't all agree with you. And then you get so far ahead of your congregation as a prophetic leader, they start shooting at you because they think you're the enemy and not a part of them. Or you get to a point where you're like, oh, well, so-and-so is like 80% right, but the 20% they don't agree with my version of how to be a good progressive this or that is bad enough. They're basically Hitler. And you have this like outrage towards like a lack of purity around our convictions. And that critique of naive idealism that he's challenging isn't because the dreams we might dream isn't beautiful and inspiring and should bring prophetic judgment to the present. It's because he's going, and that's not why those dreams are to be drummed. They don't serve a purpose to justify our disengagement in participating in the ways we can and with the power and influence our voices have on the process of the daily grind of existence.
Yeah, and there's actually a story from, Niebuhr's career that illustrates this point that I think you're making. After he left his church in Detroit and went off to become a professor at Union Theological Seminary, the pastor that succeeded him was very passionate for civil rights, which Niebuhr also was very passionate for civil rights. And his successor wanted to work very hard to integrate their church in the Detroit suburbs. And what happened was that he really kind of slammed smack dab into the congregation who weren't ready to go there yet. And so what happened was that this led to a controversy, and Niebuhr did something I think most of us would say former pastors should not do, which is that he stuck his nose back into the politics of his old congregation. And he criticized his successor for trying to move the congregation too fast on that point. That it wasn't that he didn't think that the congregation should get there. He had written explicitly that this is exactly where the church should be. But he thought that the sort of the ideological and the idealistic fervor of his successor was leading him to want to go too far too fast. Now, the problem, though, when you take that example, is that this points to a real limitation, I think, in Niebuhr's idealism. And it's something that shows up again at the height of the civil rights movement, where Martin Luther King invites Niebuhr to participate in a petition I remember, I think it was to allow a march in Alabama. I don't remember the specifics. And Niebuhr refused because he thought that King was trying to go too far too fast. And the problem I have with that is that it reminds me far too much of exactly the liberal clergy that King is criticizing in a letter from Birmingham jail. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if Niebuhr was at least somewhere in King's consciousness when he was writing that letter, because there were several times in the 1950s and 60s where Niebuhr's advice to the civil rights movement was, slow down, you're going too fast. And I think that that's a point where one can criticize Niebuhr for having not been idealistic enough.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that tension, right? Like it's always easy to bring up those in a historical perspective, right? Because we know how certain elements of it resolved and certain problems of it linger. But if you put yourself in any of those positions, you can imagine a place where what happened was what you thought was the best case you could do then, and that doing the opposite was. And then a lot of ministers and leaders regularly in that position where you have these ideals and you also are connected to the people you're leading and you care about them, and you also know the struggle for justice that's going on in a larger setting, and you feel overwhelmed. You don't know what responsibility looks like. And right. In one of the things I think that both Martin Luther King and Niebuhr point out is that inaction's not being responsible, and also that the reflection about the issues is a theological question. That the challenge of the beloved community, the challenge of the love command, these things form the heart of both of their reflection around the issues. And in one sense, the biggest problem is disengaging from theological reflection on it, than a particular one. Because, maybe it's just being postmodern or something, but I think a lot of times the church benefits from having very different commitments, that the ecosystem of the church around an issue, you need people at different places arguing for different things and advocating for it. And even having done the podcast this long, there are people I know that when they first started listening are like conservative evangelicals and like, Tripp, you're so edgy. And then later they're like, you're basically a fundamentalist Republican. I'm like, and vice versa, where they've come the other way. And so part of that experience makes me think, one of the gifts we should be able to give each other at this point is, one, changing our mind, but also allow people the possibility of having very different answers right now than you do, because who knows? You could be protecting the justification for your own participation later.
Right. Well, and I remember a few years ago I was invited to speak at Chicago Theological Seminary, and at the end of my lecture, which I suppose had some very Niebhurian themes in it, one of the students in questioning me got very agitated with my answers, and he shouted at me, "You're not radical enough." And I responded to him. I said, "I'm not here to be radical for you, right? I'm here to try and answer these questions and try and come up with, the best solution that I can come up with on the basis of the possibilities that are before me. We can always spin castles in the air. Right, but the question that we always need to confront is, what are the possibilities that lie before us right here and now, and how can we strategize in such a way as to maximize our success in achieving those possibilities?" Mm-hmm. And let me just, before we move on, let me just say one thing real quick about King, because I want to make clear that King was very, very influenced by Niebuhr. And if you read Stride Toward Freedom, he makes that influence very clear. And that I'd say Niebuhr was almost as, if not as important to King's development as a political strategist and civil rights activist as Gandhi was.
So, do you think this kind of challenge that is put to naive idealism? I feel like we're already getting to the fourth reason to love your neighbor. And that is that he understands that the relationship of love and justice, but not just like he understands it, but that is an essential thing to work out. And it's a challenging thing to work out, and it requires a type of critical, nuanced reflection that most propagators of the terms aren't often willing, ready, and able to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago about, the way that love functions as a dimension of human nature, and the idea that human beings, according to Niebuhr, as individuals are capable of acting in a loving way. And he means something very specific by that, because Niebuhr argues that love isn't simply, and this is of course something that's kind of bog standard Christian theology, love is not simply about your emotions or how you feel about things, right? But that love ultimately comes down to the question of sort of how you act and whether or not your actions are done in such a way that they benefit or advantage others. And Niebuhr says that as individuals, we can always choose to forego our privileges. We can always choose to forego our own advantages in the name of someone else. And in fact, Niebuhr says that the fundamental dimension of Christian love is precisely that Christian love always gives over to the other rather than insisting on its own rights. So it's always a self-giving love. It's always a self-sacrificial love. And that the problem that we have when we try to live that out in public is precisely that I can sacrifice on my behalf, but I can't sacrifice on your behalf. So that's why as groups, we're just not capable of loving, because we can't collectively choose to self-sacrifice. And our leaders can't choose to sacrifice on our behalf. Rather, as leaders, they're responsible for ensuring our well-being, even if ideally they might individually prefer to engage in self-sacrificial action, right? So the key thing to understand is that for Niebuhr, love requires self-sacrificial action. But since in society we're not capable of engaging in collective self-sacrifice, this is where justice comes in, because justice is, as Niebuhr says, the approximation of love under fallen conditions, which is to say that given the fact that we can't, as a society, engage in self-sacrifice, we can nevertheless seek to balance the various interests of individuals in society in order to ensure that nobody gets more than they're entitled to. Right. And that if we strive for justice, even if at times that striving for justice means giving up our own advantage, that the desire for justice is creating within society an approximation of that possibility that we as Christians can have through acting via self-sacrificial love. Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe you can take that thought and then kind of and help us think through. I think one of the challenges we have today within the U.S. is a lot of the rhetoric and even the debate on both sides during the past election was around topics that, upon further investigation, are very small variables to what it is with globalization, automation, technological change that is impacting the earning potential of most labor. That we end up kind of having fights around smaller issues because no one's going to get elected if they get up there and say, oh, we're going to have to sacrifice together collectively to accomplish this. We're going to have to do this and this and this. It either sounds like they can't make the promises necessary to move towards greater justice, equity, and that type of thing, or just to recognize that American exceptionalism in air quotes, and the constant growth of the market and better life for generations and all that kind of that dream was built on an economy that assumed a world war and levels of destruction and our power and place in it. Like, there's so many like things that have more influence over the questions we're debating politically, and they don't get brought up because you don't say, and this might cost something from you. And right. It's like, how does this dynamism and this realism kind of help us want to reflect and reassess where we put our energy, organizing and describing and forming others around political predicaments?
I mean, I think the best way for me to approach that question is to ask, kind of, if Niebuhr were alive today, and if he were able to be active in the political realm, where would I expect to see him be active? Now, of course, granting for a moment that this is completely a reflection of my own biased reading of Niebuhr, right? I'm reading Niebuhr through my own lens. And so I suppose to some degree I could be accused of projecting my own political preferences on. But nevertheless, given what I know about Niebuhr, I think that he probably would be very concerned with and active in promoting things like Black Lives Matter. And I think that, again, given his interest in civil rights, and given his recognition that the kinds of abuse of power that any political authority is subject to would lead him to recognize that we've given too much power to police, and that we have given too much authority to police, to the degree that it becomes impossible in some realms to even question them with regard to their own authority. So you stand up to the police and you get accused of being anti-cop, even if the police are doing things that are wrong. And I think Niebuhr would look at something like that and he'd say that is, that's a place where Christians need to be active. But I'd also suggest that in the 1950s, Niebuhr was looking at a bipolar world in terms of foreign policy, where in the wake of World War II, there were basically only two great powers, and that was us and the Soviet Union. And in a situation like that, he thought it was absolutely necessary for the United States to take a leading role in world affairs. In 2017, I suspect that Niebuhr would probably say that it's necessary for the United States to come to terms with the possibility that genuine justice requires us to have a smaller role in world affairs, right? That we cannot continually be the single largest global hegemon, but that we have to find ways to make way for other nations to collaborate with us in terms of the creation of a genuine global society. And Niebuhr's own promotion of and support for the United Nations, his work with the Council on Foreign Relations and things like that, make me think that he would say that while the United States has a particular role to play, that in fact we have lost as much in terms of moral stature through our hegemony over the last half century and more, as we have gained in terms of power and influence. And that was always a risk that he thought was endemic to our taking on global leadership, that we were always going to risk romanticizing our own desire for power and forgetting the need to limit that power in ways that allowed us to act morally. So I think he would say that we cannot be American exceptionalists in that sort of kind of classic sense of the word. Rather, we need to recognize that we're only exceptional to the degree that we have the capacity to recognize that we're no different than any other country.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we kind of already started to get there, but the fifth reason, before you're going to have to rapid fire answer a stack of questions, because there's ones on Facebook and people that are signed into the webinar, because I didn't realize that they were going to show up in different places, because the first time I clicked the Facebook button. But the last reason is that Niebuhr helps us understand today's world. And so I want to know, like, just channel your Niebuhr and then tell us what in the world would Niebuhr make of Mr. Trump?
I have to take a deep breath and sigh deeply. So, I mean, first of all, one of the things that, and I'll try to do this really fast because I want to get to the questions too. It's important to understand that Obama was actually deeply influenced by Niebuhr, and his theology, the theology that he brought to the way that he governed over the course of 8 years, was deeply influenced by how Reinhold Niebuhr thought. And a lot of reasons why we are in the midst of a so-called Niebuhr revival right now is because of the influence that Niebuhr had on Obama and the way that Obama channeled that into his own governance. And whether or not you think Obama was a good president or a bad president, chances are that will reflect to some degree or another on what you think of Niebuhr as a commentator on public issues. With regard to Trump, I mean, the thing to realize, as I said before, you couldn't pin Niebuhr down to a particular political perspective on the right or left. And that has to do with Niebuhr's so-called disputed legacy. There are some people who look at Niebuhr and see him as being more on the right. Some people see him more as being on the left. But in terms of the actual politics of his day, he was firmly on the left. He was a supporter of Franklin Roosevelt. Before that, he had run for the Congress as a socialist on 2 occasions. And probably the line that sticks in my head as much as anything else comes from actually a letter that Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court justice, wrote to Reinhold after Eisenhower's election in what would it have been, 52? 50 was, I was 52. It would have been 52. So Eisenhower becomes president. Niebuhr is despondent over it. And Louis Brandeis writes a letter to Ursula, Reinhold's wife, and he says, please remind Reini that, he says the rest in German, but I'll translate it. He says, remind Reini that, how does the saying go? Something like, for this, basically something like there is no talking to a stupid person, right? And that he looks at Eisenhower and he looks at John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State that Eisenhower chose, and he says these two people are incurably dumb. He says one is genial and dumb, and one is and one is vicious and dumb, but they're both dumb nonetheless. And that Dulles says when stupidity and evil are combined, then we have devil's bread. That was Eisenhower, who I think we would generally look back on today and say he was sort of the last of the great liberal presidents, at least as Republicans go, because after Eisenhower we then wind up with Nixon, and then it's all downhill from there. Most of us would look back and say, Eisenhower was a pretty good president. And compared to Trump, Eisenhower was a fabulous president. But I think that if Niebuhr was in despair over the stupidity and malice of the Eisenhower administration, I think there's no question in my mind that he would be apoplectic over the possibilities that are inherent in a Trump administration. And I think what he would say to us in this moment is that this is the time when it is most important for us to embrace that idea of Christian realism and to be willing to stand up and confront evil, while again not assuming that confronting evil in the form of the kinds of policies that the Trump administration is proposing absolves us from recognizing our own complicity.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna throw questions at you because I don't want to take up more time than necessary. But the first question: what does Christian realism do when tackling the problem of climate change and ecological crisis, given it knows no borders?
I'm not sure what's meant by it knows no borders. I think that Christian realists have been involved in the environmental struggle for some time. And the thing with any with any form of realism, and particularly with Christian realism, is that, again, it tries to split the difference between sort of a cynical approach to saying nothing can be done and nothing should be done, and it's all about Machiavellian power relations, and saying, well, no, we absolutely have to do everything here and now, and if you're not doing everything now, you're not doing anything. And so I think that a Niebhurian or a Christian realist approach to climate issues would say that things like, for example, the Kyoto Accords, right, and the climate protocols that were theoretically agreed to under Obama were important step forwards, even though they were only partial solutions to the problem, and that if we actually were successful at implementing those kinds of policies, then we could look toward doing things like trying to move away from fossil fuels, trying to create a more sustainable ecology, but that partial successes and partial moves forward aren't negated by the fact that they don't solve every problem all at once.
Mm-hmm. So, why does Stanley Hauerwas hate Reinhold Niebuhr, and should he?
Well, Stan would say that he doesn't hate Niebuhr; he loves Niebuhr. He says there's a video that I show sometimes to my class where he even says that, and it's kind of typical Hauerwasian fashion, right? You know, with the West Texas accent. But then he goes on and says the problem that he has with Niebuhr is that he doesn't think that Niebuhr has a lot to say to Christians in the contemporary world. And here is the point where I got to say that I think that Stan has just badly underestimated Niebuhr's continuing relevance to Christianity in the 21st century. And I honestly think that that's probably associated with the fact that a lot of the things that are dearest to Niebuhr's heart are just not things that Stan cares about very much. And so for him, they just don't seem very relevant. He's not interested in trying to make the political order more just. He's interested in trying to get Christians to think about how Christian communities can embody that sort of communal spirit of Jesus Christ more fully. And those aren't the same questions. So I would say that I think, and when Stan criticized Niebuhr in With the Grain of the Universe, there are a number of points where he just committed complete howlers of misunderstanding Niebuhr.
So do we have a Niebuhr today? If so, who is it? If not, is it possible?
Who would be a good Niebuhr today? There are ways in which, I look at people like Michael Eric Dyson as a good sort of contemporary analog to Niebuhr, someone who takes his Christian faith and seeks to live it out in the public sphere as a public intellectual. He doesn't shy away from identifying himself as a Christian, but he also tries to affirm the need for a realistic understanding of Christian faith in the public sphere. So he's someone that I would hold up as being one example of that kind of spirit. But I think the problem that we have is that we don't need one Niebuhr. We need 1,000 Niebuhrs, right? We need 1,000 people willing to go out into the world and speak up on behalf of, a pragmatic Christian engagement with the problems of contemporary society.
Do you think, at this point, the realism of Niebuhr is something that would reinvest in the democratic experiment in the United States, in some type of modified neoliberal type economy? Or at what point would realism lead to a calls for more type of revolutionary response when it comes to politics, economy, and such?
It's a good question. I mean, Niebuhr was not shy about advocating for radical politics, particularly earlier in his career. If you read, Moral Man and Immoral Society is a very radical book in terms of its political prescriptions. And at that point, Niebuhr was very strongly influenced by Marxism. And similarly, Reflections at the End of an Era is fairly explicit in calling for some form of revolution. But I think that the problem is the recognition that revolutions are always very chancy affairs, because revolutions aren't typically launched by moderates. They tend to be launched by radicals. And the problem is that radicals are often those who are least aware of their own capacity for self-delusion and self-justification. And so therefore they're the ones that are most likely to recapitulate the sins of the regime that they're trying to overthrow. So I'd be cautious about revolutionary rhetoric. But that having been said, I think a radical response to the contemporary social situation is definitely warranted on Christian realist grounds, because clearly the kind of go slow moderation of the Obama administration, as much as it was influenced by Niebuhr, was not effective at promoting the kind of progressive policies that I think Niebuhr and Obama and myself would like to see promoted.
What do you think Niebuhr's biggest critique of the American church would be in light of, I guess, its leadership's inability to prepare its members to think theologically and systemically about so many issues that were just rather blatant in the election and across the United States in real different forms?
Yeah, well, I mean, the numbers are appalling, right? I think it was 80% of white evangelicals voted for Trump, 60% of white Catholics voted for Trump, and maybe there are people in the audience who are like, yeah, right on Trump. But from my perspective, those numbers are absolutely horrifying. And I think what Niebuhr would say is that what's affecting the Christian church today is exactly what was affecting it when he was writing. The liberals lack any strategic consciousness in terms of trying to promote genuine social change. And I think staking out an idealistic position that doesn't actually cost them anything except the cost of paper to print it on, and don't actually have any plan to implement that's a strategy for bringing about that progressive vision, it's always going to fail. And this was exactly the problem that Niebuhr confronted with the liberalism of his own day. It was ineffectual, it was mealy-mouthed, and it lacked any comprehensive vision for real social progress. Meanwhile, evangelicals are so wrapped up in the form of crude nationalism and personal Jesus idolatry that they do not recognize that there is a great wide gulf between the Christ of faith and the Jesus of Americanism, and that therefore they assume that if Franklin Graham stands up and gives his blessing to Donald Trump, then that is evidence that, in fact, God has blessed this new regime. And Niebuhr would say that that's absolutely not the case. And he excoriated Billy Graham in the 1950s for promoting just this kind of individualistic conservative religion, and it hasn't gone anywhere in the last half century.
So I had a conversation with a number of friends about this repeatedly. But imagine Niebuhr sits down at a nice dinner table, and a bunch of seminarians are having a fight, and you got the let's be rational, you should vote for Clinton, and then you got the Bernie or Busters. How's Niebuhr going to enter the conversation?
I think Niebuhr would probably say, I respect the Sanders supporters' passion for justice and desire for real social change. But at the end of the day, a realistic understanding of how politics works and what we are capable of achieving given the particular circumstances that we face would probably have led him to endorse Clinton. Now, hindsight being 2020, we might say, well, that might not have been the best choice either. But I think that probably that kind of embrace of a pragmatic classical liberalism that Clinton, I think, represented, sort of kind of the middle of the road on the Democratic left, as opposed to the left wing of the Democratic left, was probably where Niebuhr, particularly after Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, that's probably where he felt most comfortable. But I should probably note that the left wing of the Democratic Party, when Franklin Roosevelt was president, was far, far to the left of the left wing of the Democratic Party today. And when you look at the kinds of things that Bernie Sanders was advocating, they were actually fairly standard issue Democratic proposals under the Democrats in the 1940s.
So how would Niebuhr's thought help us frame questions around identity politics, political correctness, these issues that get heard really differently at in different parts of the country, who affect lives of people depending on what race, class, and city or rural areas you live in? I think that one of the places that we have a challenge as a church is dealing with those issues, precisely because they get heard and experienced so differently, based on so many different variables that are not always how the church kind of divides itself up.
Right, and I think that Niebuhr would say that a lot of the discourse that we're currently experiencing around those issues suffers from exactly that kind of sense that I'm totally right and my opponents are totally wrong, that he was criticizing among the social gospelers, in his own day. Right? So the movie The Big Lebowski. You know the line from fairly early in the movie where they're leaving the bowling alley and he's complaining to his friend about his behavior, and he says, "It's not that you're wrong, it's just that you're an a-hole." There's a way in which I think Niebuhr would look at the debates that we have about identity politics and things like that, and he would say to the participants in those debates, it's not that you're wrong, it's just that you're an a-hole, right? That your assumption that you come at these issues from a place of pristine morality blinds you to the way in which your own limited horizon prevents you from seeing that the other person in the conversation may have a point. And I would say that this is the case on both sides. He would look at everybody involved in these conversations and say, for people who are criticizing political correctness, that they have failed to recognize the genuine cries for justice that create the context out of which people advocate for what is often called politically correct positions. But he would also say to the people advocating those positions that the fact that you have a point doesn't absolve you from the obligation to listen carefully to the arguments that your opponents are making and address them with integrity rather than just dismissing them as reactionary and racist.
Mm-hmm. All right. The last question that I got is, if Niebuhr was getting to sit down with ministers who are leading churches, walking into pulpits in the United States today, and was going to give advice of what fruitful resistance looks like, how would he frame the conversation and call us to turn energy and attention in taking the pulpit and leading your congregation and working in the public square?
Well, I think one of the things that he would say is that the most important thing to do if you're a pastor is to be deeply involved in the needs of your own community. That there's a way in which struggles for justice on a global level, while important, are abstract, whereas struggles for justice on the local level are always the most concrete things you can be involved with. So if you go back and you read his account of when he was a young pastor in Leaves from the Notebook of a Tame Cynic, what's striking about that is that he was always involved in these sort of the big issues of striving for social justice on a national scale. He was interested in anti-war issues. He was interested in writing on, and having a national stage. But he was always also deeply involved in the pastoral issues that were going on in his own community, the struggle for workers' rights in Detroit, struggles to unionize in Detroit, and that there's always going to be a place for us to realize the need to act on behalf of justice right around the corner from where we live. We don't necessarily need to always be thinking about, flying halfway across the world or flying to Washington, D.C. to make an impact. If we're striving to make an impact on a local level, then we need to look for those local locations where that's possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and introducing some Niebhurian ideas, answering questions. And I'm just glad it was a reason for us to connect on the internet.
It's always a pleasure, Trey.